I'm just gonna take attendance because what I'm gonna do after this is just send everybody some info. Hi, Caroline. And
Oh,
hello, Colleen. Okay, I will put into the chat the PDF of the information that I had sent through yesterday that has our offer instructions and buyer assumptions and all that good stuff. Had anyone had an opportunity just to open it up or take a peek? If no, that's okay. Okay. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. And let's make sure. What's going on here? Okay. Can you guys see the offer document that I put together for this? It's subject property 5142 North Shoreland.
yes.
Yep.
Great. Okay, cool. So our property here is a listing that went up a few days ago in Whitefish Bay, and I'm just gonna open up MLS. 42. So let's just take a quick looky-loo. Okay, here it is. So it's a 3-bed, 1.5 bath, 2-story on Shoreland in Whitefish Bay, just shy of 1,300 square feet. I'm going to take a quick look down below in some of the private remarks just to see if there's anything that we should know with regards to maybe some special instructions or seller preferences, but it looks like there's just some information here about how to deliver offers, who to deliver to. There's actually a tenant living in this house, so you'll see when we go through inclusions and exclusions, one of the exclusions will be specific to the fact that there is some tenant occupying the property. It's leased through July 31st, 2025. And then room dimensions, all that jazz are not verified. You'll see for our practice today, we're not really going to be filling out anything as it pertains to the lease agreement. We're just going to pretend that this is just going to be a situation where the tenant will already be out by the time that closing starts. I didn't want to make it any more complicated than it needed to be because for offer practice, I like to do more of just like the standard blocking and tackling, just so you guys can get your reps in and you can kind of get into the habit of writing a lot of, more of the standard the standard contingencies versus, spending a ton of time on addendum R, which would be the rental property addendum we would include. So Will Stelle is our listing agent. We have all of his information here. And I'm just going to go back now to the offer document. So our buyer today, I did Damian Lillard again, just because he was in the news and he just had Achilles surgery. So shout out to Dame Time. So Mr. Lillard signed a buyer agency back at the end of April, so it's very recent. And when he signs a buyer agency with us, what does that make him in the relationship? Does he become a customer or a client?
He's a client.
He's a client. Very good, Justin Price. Okay. And he agreed to compensation of 2.4%, and that buyer agency agreement is valid for 90 days. His closing time frame is flexible. He does want to have a few inspections as it pertains to the home inspection and a radon inspection. And he's been pre-approved for up to 550. Planning on putting 20% down. We'll assume a 7.2% mortgage rate, but he's going to be getting a 30-year conventional loan. So all important things to know because they will be influencing how we fill out the financing section. So let's make some preferences for some assumptions for our offer. The seller is asking for binding acceptance, only needs a little bit of time, not a ton of time. Does want to close ASAP. So that's where it's a little bit different than what's really happening with the home itself. And the seller is willing to pay a buyer's agent, which is great. And the direction was to write that piece into the offer. So you'll see how we do that at the end of the offer to purchase. So specifically for the offer, this isn't, I always say this isn't competitive offer practice. This is just good old offer practice. So in PC, we do every now and then have sessions where we talk about like how to write a competitive offer, what makes something a little bit more competitive. But for today, it's just going to be good old, we're writing a standard old offer. So we're going to offer what they're asking in terms of price, the $499. Anything that was on MLS as it pertains to inclusions, the buyer is okay with. And then anything that was in MLS that was outlined as an exclusion, the buyer is fine with as well. We'll have a closing date of June 6th, so about 30 days. Earnest money, he has 2% of the purchase price ready to go. And we always like to state too, in terms of earnest money, what we're seeing in the marketplace is most common 1 to 3% of the purchase price that buyers are offering. But again, that could be buyers could offer more, could offer less. It's really how you want to craft and strategize with your buyer, that part of the offer. And then in terms of the contingencies, we know that our buyer wanted the home inspection and the radon inspection, which are included, which we will include. And we'll give the seller the right to cure, which is very common in our marketplace right now. It's still a seller's market, so giving the seller the right to cure makes those contingencies a little bit more attractive. We are going to have the appraisal contingency included with giving the seller the right to cure, but he being our buyer, does have a little bit of extra cash on hand that he could use to cover any gap between the appraised amount and the offer price. So he's got $6,500 ready to go if needed. He's going to be getting financing, so we'll include that within the offer. And then we also will be including the fact that the seller will be compensating the buyer's firm. And what I always note here too is like, this is a 30-day close. It's not terribly uncommon anymore to have 30 days. 30 days used to be lightning fast, but 30 days is becoming pretty typical these days. But something to always keep in mind, when you have a shorter closing, make sure that you have your deadlines for your contingencies. You've kind of got them paced throughout those 30 days. You don't want to necessarily load everything to the end of those 30 days because that might not make your offer as attractive as it could be. So that's what we got for the instructions. If I go into zip forms, I've got one already filled out based on how we are to fill it out, like a little bit of an answer key. So the first thing I'm going to do is show you guys how I filled out the residential offer to purchase. So here we are. Today's date is May 6th. And because Damian signed a buyer agency agreement with us, that makes him a client. And therefore, I have struck out that the person drafting the offer is in fact the agent of the buyer. So I've struck out agent of seller or listing firm, and then agent of buyer and seller. I put his name here on line 3, the address for the property in line 4. And we know that the home is in Whitefish Bay, but the municipality type is what we need to put here at the beginning of line 6. So the property resides in the village of Whitefish Bay. If you don't know if it's a village or a city or a town, just come back to MLS, and here is the municipality type as filled in by the listing agent. So that's where you find that if you aren't quite sure. So this house is in the village of Whitefish Bay, and it's in the county of Milwaukee. So we have to put the county name here. And if you don't know where or what county the home resides in, you can go back to MLS. And the county is up here towards the top of the MLS detail sheet. Oop. So moving down, I've put in $499,000 for our purchase price. And once you put the numerical value in line 10, it'll automatically populate with the written out version in line 9. But our next section here in lines, starting with lines 11 through 13, these are the inclusions. So these are the extra things that the seller is willing to leave behind in addition to all the fixtures on the property. So in our offer instructions, we had indicated that we were going to offer all of the inclusions that were listed in MLS. So if I go back to MLS, the listing agent here has indicated those items. I literally copied and pasted what was in the inclusion line and then what's in the exclusion line right into the offer. Now that's assuming if that's what our buyer in fact wanted. There might be some situations where the buyer doesn't want one of the inclusions, or maybe the buyer is adding an additional inclusion into the offer. So just make sure you are reviewing those items with your buyer and making sure that you're including and excluding what it is that they want to have in the offer. So here I've just copied and pasted all the inclusions. So the oven range, fridge, dishwasher, microwave, washer and dryer. And similar to what I just did with the inclusions, I copied right out of MLS what was listed as an exclusion, which was the seller and tenant's personal property and staging items. Below is a list of things that are typical fixtures. So anything that is affixed to the property automatically comes with the home. But if you aren't quite sure about some items, make sure that you take a look and familiarize yourself with the list of fixtures that are defined here in the offer. The seller has asked for binding acceptance by on or before 6 p.m. on May 7th. So how did I add this time frame in? When you click in the line on line 40, you select your date. And if you need to put in a very specific time, like in this offer, we want things to be turned around by 6 p.m., you just have to add it in front and voila. Otherwise, if you don't put a specific time in a deadline, then it goes automatically until 11:59 p.m. of that day. So through that full day.
And Kim, I have a question.
Yeah.
I assume, and that's always like that local time zone of
Yeah.
the.
Yes.
Got it. Okay.
Yep. Good question. Now, in terms of closing, I put here that we want the transaction to be closed on June 6th. So I just typed in June 6th, selected. And my zip forms automatically populates this language here in line 58. So closing is going to take place on June 6th at a place selected by the buyer. And that's pretty typical in our market right now. Usually like the buyer and the lender kind of figure out where closing is going to take place. So I've actually crossed off this section of line 48 because then it's a little bit contradicting. Moving up, and this is a good double check. So we need to have the address at the top of every line or every page within the offer. And you can see that zip forms didn't carry over the address correctly. So this is a great double check because all we have to do is make sure that the street address is correct. I have to change this. And our zip code is 53217. So once it changes on the top of page 2, I'm just going to do a quick spot check to make sure it's correct on the top of page 3, and it is. So you just have to correct it once, but make sure you've got the correct address at the top of the page. The first section here then is earnest money. So I had mentioned earlier that earnest money is typically anywhere between 1 to 3% of the purchase price, and that our buyer Damien was he had 2% ready to go. So 2% of $499,000 is $9,980. And I'm having that earnest money will be delivered within 3 days after acceptance. A lot of people leave 5 days or leave it blank. So if you leave it blank, it would automatically default to 5. But all this earnest money is going to be delivered to the listing firm. So I've crossed off drafting firm and then other identified as. And I would say the majority of the times you're going to see that the listing firm will be the firm that holds that earnest money in a trust account. If you're not quite sure who's holding earnest money, it's okay to give the listing agent a call just to clarify. Sometimes you'll see listing agents if they are working with a title company and the title company is going to hold onto the earnest money. They'll have that type of information outlined within MLS or within a document. But again, if you don't know, it's okay to pick up the phone and ask. Then the sections underneath the earnest money amount talk about what happens if the transaction doesn't come to closing, what happens to the earnest money. So it's not always a guarantee that, a seller can keep all the earnest money, and it's not a guarantee that the buyer will keep all of the earnest money. But all of the information here in the sections below that earnest money amount talks about gives a little bit more specificity around what could in fact happen. So make sure you familiarize yourself with that. And it's something that you should be reviewing and talking about with your buyers as well when it comes time to reviewing the offer prior to submitting. Then moving down to the bottom of page 2, they talk here about the condition report and that the state requires the seller to provide a condition report and to fill it out to the best of their knowledge. And that the seller has in fact given one to the buyer, especially in our case, they have, and we can see that in MLS. I go to documents and they've included a lead paint, a seller condition, and a seller update sheet. So our seller has in fact provided a condition report, and by filling out the date that the condition report was signed by the seller, and for us it was February 7th, that just acknowledges that the buyer is in fact in receipt of a condition report. It doesn't necessarily mean that the buyer agrees with what's on the condition report, but the buyer is acknowledging that a condition report that was filled out on February 7th has been made and that they are in receipt of it. Then all of page 3 is a list of items that could be included, or a lot of the items that are referenced in the condition report. So make sure you familiarize yourself with this as well. But I typically don't see anything crossed off or modified on page 3. Moving then into page 4 is our first contingency. So the first one right out of the gate here is the inspections and testing. So there is a difference between inspections and testing. An inspection is a visible view of the property, where a test takes something off of the property and sends it to a lab. So make sure that you are familiar and that you understand that these things are different. Because there are actual sections too within the offer where you can specify that you want to have a test completed. But when we check this box in line 193, this means that our offer is contingent upon the home being inspected by a registered and licensed home inspector. And that inspection needs to happen after the date on line 1, which is today. So the inspection has to happen after the offer has been written. And in this offer, if you wanted to have something specifically inspected, like beyond just the general home inspection, maybe you wanted to have a basement company come in because it appeared that there might be some issues with the basement. You could also write in those additional inspections right here on lines 197 and 198. Examples here are, included, like swimming pool, roof, foundation, chimney, all those things. So those would be incremental to the home inspection, the general home inspection that you would be having. And then here in the offer, it also indicates that the buyer can have any follow-up inspections that the original home inspector recommended. So maybe in that home inspection, they noted that the roof is past its prime and that there's some shingles that are getting lifted and maybe the gutters look bad. The home inspector has indicated have a follow-up inspection performed by a roofing company. Your buyer can choose to do that or they can choose not to. It's up to them. But this gives us access to do so. Now, the contingency is deemed satisfied. So this is kind of our deadline. We're going to make sure that we've got all of our ducks in a row and that we are going to have this contingency satisfied within, and I've put 12 days. So we know that our offer time frame is about 30 days since we're going to be closing on June 6th. So I want to make sure that I try to get through that home inspection contingency as quickly as possible. In my mind, in my viewpoint, the quicker the better, because this typically tends to be one of the more stressful parts of a transaction. And sometimes we wait until the home inspection has been satisfied for then the next pieces of the offer to come into place, like the appraisal and the loan commitment. So I've put 12 days here. And this 12 days doesn't mean I'm going to have the home inspection done in 12 days. This means that I'm going to have the home inspection, any follow-up inspections that my buyers want to have, and we're going to be negotiating any type of repair or credit or purchase price adjustment to the purchase price. All of those things have to happen within these 12 days. If they don't, we want to make sure that we have our ducks in a row, especially as buyer's agents, because if we don't do anything, if we don't negotiate in the form of an amendment where both parties would have to agree to any changes to the offer, if we don't do anything and on day 13, day 13 comes along, that means that your buyer has just purchased the property as is. So it's really important that you're aware of your dates and deadlines. And it's really important that you're trying to get all of your ducks in a row as quickly as possible. So you're giving yourself some time to have those follow-up inspections and do any type of negotiations. So in our offer instructions, we had indicated or it had listed that the seller was going to have the right to cure. So I put here, seller shall have the right to cure the defects. So let's talk a little bit about this. And I'm not going to go into detail because we do have separate contract trainings that are all about the home inspection process. And I will forward you links to those past trainings. But let's use the roof again as something that maybe came up the inspection. Your buyer had a roofer come out and look at it. And now the roofer says, yep, we need a whole new roof. And they've estimated that that's going to cost $12,000. So you talk through with your buyers as to whether or not they want to give the seller the opportunity to cure. A cure could be the seller replaces and fixes the roof prior to closing. A cure could be that the seller reduces the purchase price for an amount of money, and then maybe your buyers take that on after closing. Or another way to cure is possibly even getting a closing cost credit. And again, that would be up to your buyers to make any repairs to the roof post-closing. So those are a couple different ways that the seller could cure. So let's say that your buyer they're willing to take on the cost of the roof, or they're willing to take on the repairs themselves, but they would like a reduction in price. And we go back to the seller and the listing agent and say, okay, here's our inspection report. Here is the roof estimate. We're asking for a $12,000 reduction in purchase price. If the seller agrees to it, then we sign an amendment indicating such, right? And both parties have to sign an amendment in order for something to go, to move forward and to be satisfied. Well, what if the seller comes back and says, no, I'm not going to reduce the purchase price? Or maybe like, I'm not even going to reduce the purchase price. I'm not going to put a new roof on. No, I don't want to. And the seller has that right to, right? We're giving them the right to cure. It doesn't mean they have to cure it. So what happens if the seller says no, or you can't come to an agreement as to what's going to happen next within these 12 days? And I would probably at about day 11, make sure that I'm very on top of this. So what happens if the seller has the right to cure? How does the seller satisfy the contingency? So the seller can give a notice back to the buyer, and I put within 2 days. After the buyer has delivered a notice of defect stating the seller's election to cure. So we haven't talked about the notice of defect yet, but a notice of defect is a document that is used typically by a buyer when the seller has the right to cure that lists all of the things wrong with the house. And usually a notice of defect is not a good thing to receive as a seller because it might not just be the roof anymore that the buyer is looking to get a purchase price reduction. Maybe it's a bunch of other things. So now this is really putting the seller in a position not only to fix one thing, but they've got a notice of defects to fix it all. And this is kind of a way for a buyer, if they're comfortable, submitting a notice. And if the seller comes back and says no, the buyer has the opportunity then to walk away. But I'm not going to go into any more detail about this because we we have a lot of ground to cover, and we have other training videos that you can watch. But all of this is stated here. Like if the seller had the right to cure, they can cure it by sending back a notice to the buyer indicating they're going to cure all of those defects. Then they can cure the defects in a good and workmanlike manner. And then they have to give back to the buyer a report no later than 3 days prior to closing, a report that indicates all the work that was done. But the offer is null and void. So the offer is dead if the buyer does send that notice of defect along with the inspection report, and you should send that home inspection report to the listing agent, never send it to the lender. But the offer is null and void if they send a notice of defect along with the written inspection report and that seller never had the right to cure to begin with. Or the seller did have the right to cure and the seller writes back, I'm not going to cure, so the deal's dead. Or the seller never delivers a notice back in a timely manner, so not within those 2 days. So again, I'll forward along to you guys information as it pertains to like previous trainings on the home inspection contingency, but make sure you become really familiar with this. We're seeing about 60% of offers have home inspections, 40% don't. So this is something that I think makes a lot of people nervous, but the more that you learn and the more trainings that you go to, the better and the more confidence you're going to get. So I'm going to move on to radon. Again, our buyer wants to have a radon test. So I've checked the box indicating that the offer is contingent upon the buyer having a test. Now, typically, a home inspector can actually do a radon test at the same time as a home inspection. They leave the kit in the basement. They come back in a few days to get a read on what the radon levels are at. And similar to the home inspection, we have to indicate what our time frame is. So I always have the same number of days for the radon test as the home inspection. But one other thing that we have to call out is who's going to be paying for the test. And here I've indicated that it's going to be at the buyer's expense. If you don't strike one or another, it's automatically going to default to the buyer's got to pick up the tab. So again, a lot of this language looks very similar to what was in the home inspection. So we're going to give the seller the right to cure. If they have the right to cure, here's how the seller can satisfy it. If they don't have the right to cure, what happens? So make sure, again, you familiarize yourself with the language. Joan Reed always says all of the answers to your questions are already in the offer. You just have to make sure you're familiar with the language in the offer, and it can really help you understand your various options that might exist. So moving into financing, our buyer is getting a loan. So I've checked the box in line 248. And here in line 249 is the loan type that our buyer is getting. So Damien's getting a 30-year conventional loan. Other loan types that might go into this line could be an FHA loan, a VA loan, an ARM, a 15-year conventional. So make sure you understand what type of loan your buyer is getting. And in terms of our loan commitment, I have put here in line 250 that we're going to deliver our loan commitment for our buyer within 21 days after acceptance. So if you're not quite sure how fast your lender can work, and typically the loan commitment is the last contingency to be satisfied. I always like to have a few days buffer between loan commitment deadlines and closing dates. So here I've put 21 days. If you don't know how fast your lender can go, pick up the phone and just ask. And it's always good to make sure that you have verified some of these deadlines with the partners that might need to help satisfy those deadlines, because the last thing you want to do is overpromise and then be slow and underdeliver. So I put 21 days here for our loan commitment deadline. And then in line 251, this is the amount of money that our buyer is taking out a loan for. So this represents the purchase price minus the down payment. So our purchase price was $499. Our down payment, I think, was 20%. And I'm just going to check my math really quickly in my mortgage calculator. $499, 20% down. Yes. Okay. So this represents the principal, the loan amount. And our loan is for 30 years. And then it's going to be amortized. So the interest will be amortized over 30 years. So typically these two numbers match. And then the amount of money here in line 252 represents what your buyer's monthly principal plus interest payment is going to be. It doesn't include taxes. It doesn't include homeowners insurance. This is what the mortgage amount is going to be for. So when I plug in my 20% down, my interest rate of 7.2, this is the amount of money. I rounded it. It was $2,709.72. But this is the amount of money that the buyer's responsible for every month as it pertains to their mortgage. Here too, it indicates the buyer acknowledges that the lender might also include taxes, right? They're going to be escrowing taxes every month. They're going to be escrowing home insurance. There might be PMI if a buyer puts down less than 20%. So just make sure you are telling your buyers this doesn't mean that's the amount of money that you're going to be putting aside every month. This just represents your loan. I move down then into line 264, and we have to indicate what type of financing the buyer is getting, if it's fixed rate or adjustable. A fixed rate means that the interest rate doesn't change throughout the duration of the loan. And I have put in our offer instructions that our interest rate is going to be 7.2%. If you don't know what current rates are going for, pick up the phone and ask the lender, what should I be putting in my offer as it pertains to rates? So just something to keep in mind. Then down below, this is our first contingency that we won't be including. So seller financing is where a seller helps provide financing to the buyer. When you do not include a contingency, I find it to be best practice to put NA in the box versus just leaving it blank, but it's totally up to you. Moving down into page 6, if your buyer was paying cash and not getting a loan, then the offer wouldn't be contingent on financing. So here you would be putting down how many days you would be providing a proof of funds showing that the buyer has the cash on hand to purchase it. But we're not paying for cash, or we're not paying with cash in this offer. So we're just going to skip that. Then our next appraisal, or our next contingency, is the appraisal contingency. So we're checking the box that the offer is contingent upon the buyer having the property appraised. Now, by checking this box, it doesn't necessarily mean we're asking to have the house appraised. What this contingency does, it provides more specificity around what happens if the appraisal comes in and the value is lower than what their buyers have offered. So if you get the appraisal and it comes in low, so below our $499,000 purchase price, you send that appraisal report over to the listing agent, and we would be asking the seller for the right to cure. The seller, really, the right to cure is we're asking for the seller to reduce the purchase price, right? A buyer more than likely won't be able to get a loan for the amount of money that they want to if the bank is telling them that the house isn't worth, it's not appraised at a value that meets or exceeds the purchase price. So again, this just doesn't mean that we're going to have an appraisal done. So I'll also send another, in a follow-up email, I'll send a link that has some trainings on the appraisal contingency. But what this does too is, and we'll just quickly read it. So the seller has the right to cure. We're giving them the right to cure. So what does that mean? If the seller has the right to cure, the seller can satisfy this contingency by delivering a notice back to the buyer, adjusting to the purchase price shown on the appraisal report within 2 days, after the buyer delivered that appraisal report, and a notice objecting to the appraised value. So let's quickly play this out. We're buying the house for or we offered $499. Say the appraiser comes in and they said the house is worth $490,000. So we've got a $9,000 difference. If your buyer doesn't have the money to make up the difference, your buyer's going to want to go back and ask the seller to reduce the purchase price to match the appraised value. Or maybe your buyer has a little bit of money, but they can't meet that whole $9,000 difference. And that's what when you see addendum AC come up, that's what the appraisal gap portion of the offer, that's where we're saying we'll cover a little bit of the difference. So if the buyer sends the appraisal report and they object to the appraised value, then if the seller is willing to come down on price, we have to promptly execute an amendment that officially adjusts the purchase price. Now, the offer is null and void if the seller never had the right to cure to begin with. So maybe we didn't give the right to cure and the appraised value came in at $490. Maybe your buyers don't have the money to make up the difference. And you can still ask the seller if they would be willing to drop the price, but really they never had the right to cure to begin with. Or the seller had the right to cure and the seller comes back and says, nope, I'm not going to adjust the purchase price. Or the seller doesn't get back to us in a timely manner, indicating they're going to adjust the purchase price. So our timely manner is 2 days. So again, I'll send you guys a follow-up that has some more information and more training on the appraisal contingency, but I think it'll be really helpful for you guys to understand how this gets used and how important it can be to both a buyer and for a seller. Then the next 3 contingencies within the offer are ones that we are not going to include. So our buyer doesn't have to sell their house in order to buy this one. So I put NA for the closing of the buyer's property. A bump clause typically accompanies a home sale contingency. So I've put NA here. And then the last one that I put not applicable for is the secondary offer. So you would know if you were writing as a secondary. A secondary offer means the seller's already accepted an offer and that one's in primary position. But maybe the seller's taking some backup offers and that's what would be a secondary offer. But you would know if you were writing as a secondary. Going to quickly move down into proration. So we have to give some directions as to how taxes and things like that will be prorated between the 2 parties. I've checked box 366, indicating that we're going to take taxes from the previous year and prorate those accordingly. So the seller will be responsible for paying or setting aside money for January 1st through June 5th, the day before closing, and then this buyer will be responsible for making sure they have that money on hand to help pay for taxes from June 6th through December 31st. Then this section, the remaining section on the page is all about title insurance, who pays for it. Make sure you familiarize yourself with that. Moving into page 8, if we were going to be assuming the lease, so like this house really has a renter in it right now, and the renter is there until July 30th. Well, say we are closing on June 6th, and that renter doesn't move out until June 30th. We would be filling in some information here because the property is being leased, and those leases extend beyond closing. So those leases transfer over to the new owner. But we're not going to be doing anything with that today. This section here is a bunch of definitions. This talks about how the seller needs to maintain the property in the same condition that the seller or the buyer saw it in at the time of the offer, minus normal wear and tear. This talks about what happens if there's damage to the property between the time the offer gets accepted and closing. And if the damage is less than 5% of the purchase price, the seller has to notify the buyer in writing what happened, and the seller is responsible for restoring the property back to the same condition that it was in at the time of the offer. Now, if the damage exceeds 5% of the purchase price, the seller still has to promptly notify the buyer in writing. And at that point, the buyer has an opportunity to terminate the offer, to get out of the offer. So just something, again, make sure you familiarize yourself with this language and understand what the options might be. At the top of page 9, it talks about a buyer's pre-closing walkthrough. So all buyers have the opportunity to have a final walkthrough within 3 days prior to closing. Usually that doesn't get scheduled until maybe a week or two prior to close. Occupancy, your buyer gets to assume occupancy and they own the property as soon as closing takes place and they get the keys, unless they are giving post-closing occupancy to the seller and allowing them to stay. This section here talks about default. If either party defaults on the contract, what happens? And remember, you are not an attorney and you cannot give legal advice. So if you feel that something is getting close to needing legal assistance, by all means, pick up the phone, call your compliance broker for your office and get them to be aware of what's happening, but then also refer them to a lawyer or just say, I cannot provide legal advice. That is a lawyer's responsibility to help you. But just know that by signing these documents, it does create an actual enforceable contract. I'm just going to quickly go down now to the end of the offer. And here in line 543 is the final contingency that we're including within that main offer document. And we've checked the box in line 543 indicating that the seller is going to agree to pay the buyer's firm the amount of 2.4% of the purchase price towards the buyer's brokerage. So this is where we're including our commission as buyer's agents. We're asking for the seller to pay for that as part of the offer. So make sure that you put, the percentage that that you're charging, and then make sure you also put a purchase price. And then in these blank lines, my zip forms automatically adds this information to every offer. So if a deadline expires on a Saturday, Sunday, or a federal or state holiday, the deadline automatically carries through to the next business day. The only time that doesn't happen is with binding acceptance. Binding acceptance can happen 365 days a year. Doesn't matter. And then I also added some additional language here. So we're having a home inspection and we're giving the seller the right to cure. And if we're giving the seller the right to cure, and maybe as part of the cure, the seller is going to be repairing something or fixing something, I want to make sure that the seller does that in a good and workmanlike manner using professional experts. So I've added this language here by clicking on Add Clause. And we have here 22 clauses that our attorneys have deemed acceptable for us to add or to use. And these are some of the most common things that get added to an offer. And if you go through these, you'll see there's like a bunch of stuffs. I've gone down here to the right to cure clause, and you'll see here it is right here, this language. I literally just hit insert and voila. So familiarize yourself with all the clauses that you have at your disposal. They're super helpful. Then I've put Will's name, he's the listing agent, and my name in the event we want to be delivering any of these documents in person. But our primary mode of delivery is going to be email. So I've checked box 587. The email address for the seller is the listing agent's email. And then the email address for the buyer is your own email address. We've got a couple addenda that we're going to use or include with our offer. So I've checked that box. And then I've listed the addenda here that we're going to include. And then don't forget to add your name and your brokerage as to who drafted the offer. I see this happen a lot where people don't even put their own name on there. So just make sure you do that. And that's all you have to do for the offer. I shouldn't say that's all, but that is the end of the offer. What I'm going to quickly show you then are these two amendments that will be used in conjunction with the offer. The first one is the GMAR Addendum A. And for today, there's really nothing that is getting checked on this document with the exception of one thing at the very end. But you would use Addendum A if you were asking for seller closing cost credits right out of the gate. Or maybe the seller was offering to purchase a home warranty and your buyer wants to take them up on that. You would add that here. Maybe the home is in an HOA. It could be a condo. It could be a subdivision. You have to indicate that the buyer understands what the HOA fees are. If you are getting things specifically tested right out of the gate, so maybe you notice that there might be something that looks like mold in the attic and you wanted to have that tested right away, you would check this box and you would specify what type of test you were getting. If the home was not on municipal water, so it had its own well or maybe a shared well, and your buyer wanted to have that well and the well water tested, you can do so by using this document. So here is your well water test. Here's the well test itself. But make sure you read through these because the deadlines for these types of tests are actually different than the deadlines that we just saw in the offer. Rather than those in the offer go into effect starting the day after binding acceptance. These tests, everything works actually backwards from closing. So just make sure you familiarize yourself with that. And then if the property wasn't on city sewer and it had its own private sanitary system, like a mound system, a septic or holding tank, and you wanted to have that tested, this would be the document that you would use. But I'm going to quickly go through this because a lot of this is language that just further clarifies and provides a little bit extra emphasis on right to cure, some financing things. So make sure you read through that. But the only thing that we're checking on this document is box 203, and that we're including a lead paint addendum. And lead paint addendum accompanies a house where the house was built before 1978. You have to indicate whether or not you're going to have the lead paint inspection or if you're going to waive the lead paint inspection. And you can get that addendum S off of MLS in the document section. So I'm checking the box here. And then the only other information that I'm filling in, I don't know why the date is so wonky here. The only other information I'm putting is my information here. So we have to put the name of the firm for the buyer. So it's my office address, my name, my license number, my email address and phone number. And then over here on the right-hand side is the information for the seller, which is going to be the listing agent. And I don't know why none of this is like populating, but we get all of this information from MLS. And actually, I know Will does not have his license number on here, so we would actually have to call him and find out what his license number is. Okay. And that is it for addendum A. We got one more addendum, and then we're in the home stretch. Then the last addendum that we're going to fill out today is addendum AC. And addendum AC has 3 different sections to it. It's a short form, but it's a super helpful form and can give buyers make their offer a little bit more attractive if your buyer has a home inspection, if your buyer does have an appraisal contingency. And the third section on this on this document is if your buyer wanted to leverage an escalation clause, meaning they would be willing to offer more money if another buyer came in with a competing offer that offered more than your buyer's offer. But all we're going to be using this document for today is the appraisal gap. So if you recall in our offer, we had an appraisal contingency included. And we also know that Damien, our buyer, indicated he had a little bit of extra money on hand in order to give ourselves a bit of a buffer or help cover a gap if the house didn't appraise for what we offered. So let's go back to the example that I had talked about earlier. We're purchasing or we're offering the $499,000 on the house. Well, what if the house appraises at $490,000? So we've got a $9,000 difference. When we check this box on line 28 of Addendum AC, this means that the offer includes an appraisal contingency, which it does, and the appraised value is less than the purchase price. The buyer agrees to cover the difference up to blank. So the higher the number you have in here, the more attractive to the seller. But remember, the higher amount you have here, that means your buyer has to have that cash on hand to bring to closing. So let's read this section really quickly. If the offer includes an appraisal contingency and the appraised value is less than the purchase price, the buyer agrees to cover the difference up to $6,500. So that's what Damien, our buyer, said they could do. Buyer hereby represents they have sufficient funds to cover the gap and the amount financed in the financing contingency. Buyer is hereby prohibited from sending a notice objecting to the appraised value unless the appraised value is lower than the purchase price minus the appraisal gap. So let's talk about our example again. We offered $499, the appraised value came in at $490. We've got a $9,000 gap. Damien said he'd be willing to pay up to $6,500 if this happens. So what is the new value that Damien is willing to purchase the house for? $496,500. So what we're really now asking the buyer or the seller to do is, hey, we originally offered you $499. It appraised at $490. We had $6,500 to try to make up that gap, that difference. Therefore, we're at $496,500. Mr. or Mrs. Seller, we are asking that you officially reduce the purchase price to $496,500. That's the gap, right? So if the seller had the right to cure in that appraisal contingency, the seller can satisfy the contingency by delivering a notice back to the buyer, adjusting to that purchase price. The purchase price value then is the value that was shown on the appraisal report, the $490 plus the appraisal gap, $6,500. All other terms remain the same. Maybe let's say we offered $499 and maybe the house appraised at $495. So we've got a $5,000 difference. We don't need the whole appraisal gap, right? It's going to get us back. What if the house we offered $499 and the house appraised at $505? What do we do? We don't have to do anything. We don't show this listing agent what the appraised value is. We don't need to negotiate. If the appraised amount comes in at or higher than what you offered, that's great. That's great. Just don't tell the listing agent what that value was. They don't need to know. So then the remainder of this page, we aren't going to be filling out because we're only using it for the purpose of the appraisal gap. So when you're submitting, if I was submitting this offer, I would be including the offer to purchase. I would be including addendum A, addendum AC, addendum S, the lead paint. I would be having my buyer sign the condition report. And then I'd also be including a copy of the buyer's pre-approval letter, and all of that would go into the offer packet that I would then send to the listing agent. So if you guys want practice, please, by all means, like give it a try. Send me your offer packet and get that over to me by 1 o'clock tomorrow, and I will give you feedback. I like to go line by line and let you guys know maybe some tips or some suggestions. But by all means, like the more practice you can get in, the better. And I hope you take me up on that. Let me see. Do we have a questions here? Thanks, Kim. Okay, thanks. If anyone has questions, by all means, let me know, but I hope to get some practice offers from you. And I will also be sending you all a follow-up after this with links to the home inspection contingency training as well as the appraisal contingency training. Thanks, everybody.